With the ever-increasing number of web apps, most general computing that normal people are going to do can be done inside of your web browser. If you want to go write, say, a document, or you want to have a conference call, or check your emails, or edit some pictures, or even if you're a programmer, there are web-based code editors and IDEs that are basically as good as their desktop variants. So this makes the operating system you're running basically irrelevant to all of those tasks. Wouldn't you then want the lightest operating system possible to dedicate as many resources as you can to your browser? But you don't actually see people swapping, and this, I think, is because most people just really don't care about what OS they're running. If you know that you're on Windows, but you couldn't tell me if you're on Windows 7, Windows 8, or Windows 10, you're probably not going to be the kind of person who would ever swap out their operating system. And this is why I think it's really important to have machines that are shipped with Linux, because there's a lot of people who are in that camp. I know it's really hard to imagine there are people who don't know how computers work when you are the sort of person who does, but I can guarantee that most people just use their computer and don't know anything about it. And along with this, I think you need to introduce Linux as early as possible, because even if you don't know what operating system you're using, you're going to want to stick with what feels comfortable. And I think this is part of the reason why you see so many developers out there using Macs. I've heard some of my old professors justify this as saying, OS X is a Unix-like environment, making it better for development. But by that same logic, the BSD distros and the Linux distros fit in that exact same category as well. So during the early 2000s and 2010s, a lot of schools were starting to introduce laptops to their students, getting them to do most, if not all, of their work on those laptops. Now, you can argue whether or not that was a good thing, but that is what started to happen. And what was happening during that time is a lot of schools were starting to use MacBooks, my school being one of them. And this wasn't just a thing for like really rich private schools. I went to like a pretty average public school, and even my school, every single student was supplied with a MacBook. It was a couple of years old, but it was still a MacBook. And the reason why they could actually afford to do this is because Apple was providing really, really big education incentives to make it so schools could actually afford these. I didn't get a MacBook until I was in high school, but my school was like this really weird school. It was like a super school is what they call them here. Basically, it is from like the start of schooling up to the end of high school, all in like one big campus. And when I started going to that school, everyone in that school either had an iPad if you were, I think, below grade 7, or you had a MacBook if you're above that in the high school grades. By having this program, it made the devices cheaper than most of the competition, and when the students would inevitably break them because they're dumb kids and they're going to break something, you also got Apple support. So the schools could get these repaired fairly easily and get them replaced, and the students just go about their day continuing to work and break the devices without really having to worry about much. And what's going to happen then if you spend most, if not all of your schooling using a MacBook, plus at that time, obviously, the iPhones were getting really, really popular. Apple was building up this Apple ecosystem. If you've been using a MacBook your entire life and you've got all this other stuff in the Apple ecosystem, what are you going to use when you start going into, say, a programming job that allows you to use OS X? Well, you're probably going to use OS X. Even before that point, though, my university had a lot of Windows labs, but most of the programming classes were going to be in the Mac labs. So you go through schooling using Macs, you go into university, you use a Mac. It's just an obvious choice to keep using a Mac. Now, the education system has started to shift a bit since then. Microsoft hasn't done anything. They've completely dropped the ball. Apple keeps making their devices more and more expensive. They don't really make any sense in that system either. Now there's Google. Google has their Chromebooks. Chromebooks have completely taken over this space. If you like to complain about developers using Macs, give it another maybe 10 or 15 years. Because if Chromebooks keep taking over the education space, I guarantee there are going to be developers out there doing all of their work on a Chromebook. Now, that might sound ridiculous, and it does sound ridiculous, but I guarantee it's going to be happening. Because when you first start using a computer, you don't really have any sort of bias towards an operating system. If you take someone today who's never touched a computer, and then you put them in front of like MS-DOS, and you give them the resources they actually need to learn that system. There's nothing stopping them actually learning it, and if that's all they can use, they will eventually learn how to use it. But in the same vein, that's what they're going to be comfortable with. Likewise, if they start on OS X or Chrome OS, that's what they're going to be comfortable with, and that's what they're probably going to like, especially if they've never used anything else. You can't really say whether you like something or not without having an actual point of reference to actually compare it to. And the exact same is going to be true for things like Linux and the BSD distros as well. If you start someone from an early age using those systems, that's what they're going to learn how to use. And this early Linux problem shines a light on a whole nother issue as well, the dominance of things like the Microsoft Office suite and Photoshop. So things like GIMP and the LibreOffice suite are perfectly capable tools, and any of the gap that does exist, you would see lessen if these tools were used more often. But what you see is very, very low industry adoption. While these tools may be free of cost theoretically to use, they're not free of cost in a business context. So let's say that you have a team of Photoshop users. If you then want to go and swap tools, let's just say swap tools to GIMP, you would have to then go and retrain the entire team. This would go and slow down or halt any existing projects. Any templates and add-ons you were using would have to be completely remade or just scrapped altogether. Bringing on any new workers would be incredibly difficult because you'd either have to train them from the ground up, or you'd have a very, very small work pool to actually go with. And if you want to collaborate with any other businesses, it's very unlikely that any of those partners are actually using these tools. Besides the few outlier businesses that make it their mission to use as much open software as possible, no business would be willing to take this risk just to use something that was free of cost. But what about at an earlier stage? What about instead of trying to introduce it at a business where it just doesn't make any financial sense, what about if it's introduced at a primary school or a high school level? No one really expects those systems, whatever the equivalent in your country actually is, to be training their students on the industry standard tools. Maybe at some point that was the case, but I feel like it's diverged really far from that at this point. While there are plenty of proprietary audio editors, I remember during primary school, we used nothing but Audacity, and since that point, Audacity has just been my go-to for audio editing. It's not until fairly recently with Muse Group doing their stuff that started to change. And nothing really stops the exact same thing happening if you, say, have a media class or a photography class, and instead of editing stuff with Photoshop, you edit stuff with GIMP instead. Or if you need to write a document using LibreOffice Writer instead of Microsoft Word. While this would be a very, very slow change, and you wouldn't see any real industry changes for maybe 15 or 20 years, the only way for this change to actually happen is for it to happen at some point, and to get people actually acclimatized to using these alternative tools. Getting people to know that things like GIMP actually can be used to go and edit images. Getting people to know that you don't need to use Word to write a document, or you don't need to use Excel to make a spreadsheet, or you don't need PowerPoint to actually make a slideshow. There are really good alternatives that can get all of this work done. And once a lot of people start to get experience using these tools, what you'll see is more and more companies start to adopt it. It's not like there's only one 3D modeling program out there. Both Maya and Blender see a lot of industry usage. In the video editing space, things like Premiere and Final Cut both see a lot of industry usage. It's not like you can't bring more tools into an industry, it just requires a lot of work to make it happen. And all of this is why I think it's really important to encourage Linux OEM machines, because this is sort of the missing key to the entire puzzle. If most people don't care about what operating system they're using and can get most of their work done inside of a web browser, and if you want people to actually start using these alternative tools, you need people to actually have a system that they can very easily work with. And that's where it makes sense to actually buy a machine that has Linux pre-installed. I don't think that most people watching this channel really care about whatever operating system comes pre-installed. If you buy like Ubuntu XPS Developer Edition, you don't care that it has, I think, Ubuntu installed. You're probably going to install something different. And likewise with any of like the System 76 or Pop! OS machines, you don't really care about what OS is actually on it. But having some sort of Linux on there, I think is incredibly important for the people who actually don't know about Linux. So what I'm going to say is if you're in the market for a new computer, most of the OEM machines are laptops, but so let's just go with those. Let's say you're in the market for a new laptop. If a machine fits what you want to do, and you can get a version of it with Linux installed, buy the Linux version, even if you're not going to use the Linux version that actually comes with it. Buy the Linux version because what that shows is that people are actually interested in having a Linux machine. And by showing them that interest, that encourages them to release more Linux machines and makes it much, much easier to actually get your hands on one of these. If you walk into a store that sells computers, I don't know what's in your country, I'm just going to say Officeworks for my country. And everything you see there is a Windows machine or a Mac machine. Obviously, you're only going to buy one of those. If there's no option for that Linux machine right there, no one's even going to consider that it's actually an option. And by making it a visible option, I think that is the first step to actually getting people to adopt Linux on a more wider scale. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section down below. Maybe you think that it's a good thing that basically no one uses Linux, and it's this really niche operating system that only has a couple of % of users. If that's the case, I would definitely like to hear about it. So if you like this video and you'd like to support this channel and become one of these amazing people over here, please go check out my Patreon, subscribe, start, leave a pay link in the comment section. Comments, description down below. I've got a podcast called Tech Over Tea available basically anywhere. I've got a gaming channel called Brodie Robertson Plays where I live stream twice a week and upload about 5 or so YouTube shorts. And then this channel's available over on Odyssey. That's going to be it for me, and I'm out.